volunteer screening trends and best practices. We hope you enjoy the presentation. We are recording the presentation, so if you need to reference it after the fact, we will be sending out the recording. I do want to bring your attention to what's on your screen right now, our upcoming events. We're having a really awesome event on August 22nd in the Detroit area called our Talent Strategy Summit, bringing in keynote speaker Vu Lei, who's the author of the popular blog. It was a Nonprofit with Balls. They've updated the name to Nonprofit AF, but we think this is going to be a great event and start some really great conversation about talent in the nonprofit sector. So please make a plan to join us there if you can. And now, without further ado, I'm going to introduce our presenter for today, Brian Nolan with Verified Volunteers. He's a senior account executive. And that's about all I'm going to say. I'm going to let Brian do a little introduction of himself and go ahead. Brian, I'm going to give you control of the screen, and I'll let you go ahead with the presentation.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Sarah. Can you guys hear me?
Loud and clear. Perfect.
Yeah, so my name is Brian Nolan. I'm a senior account executive with Verified Volunteers. I've been supporting our partnership with the Michigan Nonprofit Association for about 2 years now, supporting many programs throughout Michigan as well as across the country. But today I wanted to go over our 2017 Volunteer Screening Trends and Best Practices report. The first half of today's presentation will be in regards to that. The second half will be a little bit more about verified volunteers and the difference that we can make potentially. And we'd love to support and have one-on-one conversations with all of you guys on the line here today, especially. I'll go through a little introduction and who we are, then the 2017 Background Screening Trends and Best Practices report findings, background screening challenges that we see all the time, products and services through verified volunteers at the end, as well as our volunteer community, and a walk through the system. To start it off, I wanted to introduce a little bit about who Verified Volunteers is, along with Sterling Talent Solutions, who's our parent company. Verified Volunteers offers the only background screening platform that's really been tailored to the specific needs of the service sector, and it's the first online community to mobilize repeat vetted volunteers. Sterling Talent Solutions is our parent company. They saw a need in the service sector for a platform that was really designed for volunteer-driven organizations. But they invest capital and technology into verified volunteers. And then we also have a strategic alliance with Points of Light, who helped get us off the ground. Today you'll learn how your organization compares to other volunteer programs and where potential gaps may exist, the biggest challenges for volunteer programs and how to overcome them, as well as trends in volunteer background screening and how they compare to research from our 2016 report. Jumping right into this presentation, we'll begin with information from the second annual survey and research report, Volunteer Screening Trends and Best Practices 2017. And I've pulled some results from that report here. The audience was made up of U.S. professionals who work for nonprofit organizations that conduct background checks on their volunteers. It included both verified volunteers clients as well as non-clients. 8 of 10 respondents were affiliated with social or human services, education, youth development, or religious organizations. 95% of respondents were affiliated with organizations that serve vulnerable populations. And more than 1/3 of respondents, 37%, were affiliated with organizations with budgets of more than $1 million. 47% of responding organizations had fewer than 100 volunteers in their location, but 9% of the organizations had more than 1,000 volunteers in their location. Almost half of the responding organizations had a staffing comprising 75% or more by volunteers. Obviously, some of this information might stand out a little bit. Almost half of the responding organizations have a staff comprising of 75% or more volunteers. This data point, along with others, indicates how important volunteer human capital is to the organizational mission of the responders. Definitely seems like respondents represent some of the most volunteer-driven organizations in the sector. That, coupled with the level of those who work with VPs, shows that this sample represents a rich pool of experience insight into the state of volunteerism and volunteer screening. I also thought it was interesting how many organizations rely so heavily on volunteers. And in fact, through our survey, we found out that the number of organizations engaging more than 50 volunteers has risen from 55% to 76% from last year's survey. When we break that down into sectors, religious organizations showed the largest increase in volunteer engagement, with twice as many, 66%, engaging more than 50 volunteers this last year, when the percentage was 33%. Educational organizations showed a nearly equal increase, with 77% engaging more than 50 volunteers, up from last year's 42%. We also heard from our survey that 14% of responder organizations plan to increase their volunteer pool by a lot next year. There are very clear trend lines in research, like the Bureau of Labor Statistics survey, that show volunteer rates are steadily going down. And anecdotally, we often hear that organizations with majority volunteer-driven missions struggle with finding and retaining the types of volunteers they need. Those willing to make long-term commitments, those who display certain skills, and those who meet certain requirements, like the availability to volunteer during the work week, during work days during the week. I think there's a persistent attrition problem, organizations needing to recruit and engage new volunteers to replace those who have lapsed, so that might be a contributor to this response. But also perhaps they're engaging more volunteers because current volunteers are leaving at a greater pace. I'm thinking that one way to combat this trend would be to adopt a more strategic recruiting and cultivation plan for volunteers. For folks on the line dealing with these types of challenges, always remember that Verified Volunteers does host webinars on our calendar on our website, or feel free to join our mailing list to learn more on those issues. We have free on-demand sessions on topics around volunteer position descriptions, recruitment, cultivation, and engagement that will dive deep into these topics and provide lots of pointers and best practices.
Hey, Brian, sorry to interrupt. I'm not sure that we're on the right slide, so.
Oh, sorry about that. I apologize about that. So here's the next slide. I'll jump right into that.
Okay.
A little bit about, I think that there's no shortage of cause-based startups. Entrepreneurship in the sector is very vibrant. There are very low barriers to entry for someone to begin organizing around a cause, be it a fundraising effort online or a community-based volunteer initiative that doesn't require a 501c3 to get started, but may eventually become formal organizations. So organizations are being challenged to be creative in how they retain and engage their volunteers, given the innovation in the marketplace and demands on people's time. Another great reason to attend the webinars that I mentioned. Organizations are serving vulnerable populations. The fact that more organizations are serving vulnerable populations, a whopping 88% of respondents organizations say they serve vulnerable populations, an 11% increase from 2015. The education sector showed the biggest rise here. Last year, just over 6 in 10 organizations in the education sector said they serve a vulnerable population. This year, it was over 9. 92% of education organizations and 95% of youth organizations said they served a vulnerable population. What does this mean for volunteer organizations, especially in terms of protecting those vulnerable sectors? As we've discussed before, organizations do have a legal obligation to make sure that their stakeholders, their volunteers, those they serve, as well as their assets, are safe. Volunteers tell us they expect to volunteer in a safe environment, and that the volunteer they are standing next to at the food pantry is screened. The basic legal standard that applies to screening is reasonableness under the circumstances. If a nonprofit screening process is challenged in court, a judge or jury will evaluate the reasonableness of the process employed, the foreseeability of the risk, whether the organization knew or should have known of the risk of harm, and whether the screening process or lack of it caused or contributed to the harm at issue. An opponent may well argue that failing to conduct any screening is unreasonable. So what could you be sued for? We're hearing of increases in litigation around negligent hiring and negligent retention, and expect this trend to increase through the next years. Organizations are also obligated, when working with third-party screening providers, to follow the tenets of the Fair Credit Reporting Act when screening both their employees and volunteers. Back in 2011, the Federal Trade Commission ruled that the terminology in the FCRA does extend to contractors and volunteers. Thus, our advice is for nonprofits to make sure they understand and comply with the FCRA. Certainly, we have seen an increase in litigation around FCRA compliance issues in the for-profit world, and our legal team believes it is a matter of time before nonprofits will also have lawsuits going on that front as well. But probably more relevant for today's conversation is that screening companies are being sued for compliance violations under the FCRA. In these cases, it is because the screening provider did not take reasonable procedures to ensure that the reports that they provided were up to date and accurate. So bottom line, make sure the firm you partner with is compliant with both state and federal laws, knowledgeable, reputable, and a true trusted advisor. All such great points that organizations must always keep in mind. You don't want to find yourself at the center of a lawsuit, that's for sure. For those on the line, we don't want to take too much time poring over the FCRA, but we do know it can be confusing. If you have questions around the FCRA and would like to talk to an advisor one-on-one, we'd be more than happy to do so to walk you through the different aspects of it. Go ahead and send me a note using the widget on the right there of your screen. More organizations expect to do more background checks this year. The percentage of responder organizations who expect to do more background checks next year jumped from 48 to 61%. Social and youth organizations lead among sectors in their expectation to increase the number of background checks they run. Half of social organizations expect to increase checks a little or a lot, up 18% from last year. Almost 3/4 of youth organizations expect to increase the number of checks, up 16% from last year. You may ask, why do organizations expect to continue to increase the number of checks they run on volunteers? This is indicative of a couple of things. As the legal landscape toward nonprofits changes, we see more organizations citing the need to screen, generally because of a state law or regulatory requirement, or even a grant requirement. And organizations feel a sense of moral duty and want to do the right thing to keep their stakeholders safe. Frankly, the risk of an organization being on the front page of the paper for some heinous act by a volunteer or staff member keeps executive directors up at night. Now, this is not all bad, regardless of the motivation to screen. There's been positive changes as many organizations have improved their volunteer program management. Our survey shows more and more nonprofits are relying on volunteers to carry out their mission. To do this, nonprofits have to have put structure around their volunteer program and often have resources to manage a volunteer program. We see an increase in the use of technology, helping to streamline the process, often through an online system for the volunteer to initiate the check. We also see an increase in the use of volunteer management systems, which streamline the entire onboarding process and are often integrated with a screening company. The price point of these VMS systems has come down fairly substantially in recent years, but if you still can't get one through your budget cycle, check with your screening company to see if they have a streamlined approach to onboard and vet volunteers. We also believe that organizations are more savvy when it comes to background checks and are realizing it is one way to determine if a volunteer is a good fit for your program. This all fosters an increasing level of program oversight of volunteers in general. Interestingly, 96% of the organizations in our survey require volunteers to fill out applications in 2016, an increase of 18% from last year's numbers. So if you're not screening potential new and returning volunteers, you're opening your organization and the people it serves up to risk of harm, litigation, and damage. Beyond the obvious dangers of not screening, you may be damaging your organization's reputation with future volunteers and the public. And that's because the public believes in background checks. In a 2016 survey, our parent company, Sterling Talent Solutions, found that 95% of respondents believe in mandatory criminal background checks, and 84% believe that the safety provided by background checks is more important than an applicant's right to refuse a background check. So background screening is widely becoming acceptable these days. There seems to be so many good reasons why volunteer organizations should be screening their volunteers. Questions I like to ask is, why do you think there are still organizations out there who choose not to screen their volunteers? One of the main points there is cost. At the end of the day, cost is always a huge issue with any nonprofit because of budget. Also, just thinking about this data point some more, I wonder if there's a relationship between the growth of volunteer numbers planned and reported from previous section and this increase in number of checks. Or are they screening more of their volunteers? Or are they implementing rescreening policies that they didn't have in place previously? We can't be sure which factor is driving this increase. It's likely a combination of all three. But going back to the point on costs too, many organizations see a link between a strong volunteer program and their fundraising. A study called Time and Money, the Role of Volunteering in Philanthropy, which was conducted by Fidelity Charitable, showed that the volunteering and donations go hand in hand. The study found that 87% of volunteers acknowledged an overlap between their volunteers and financial support to a charity, with half saying they give more financial support because they volunteer. So if you strengthen your volunteer program with better screening of candidates, you could even make more money. That brings us to our next findings here. Organizations are spending more per volunteer background check. Interestingly, in this year's survey, we found that the number of organizations spending more than $30 per background check has actually doubled. Among organizations in the education sector, more than a quarter spent more than $30 per screen, up from $17 from last year's report. In healthcare, the difference was slightly more pronounced, from 11% of healthcare organizations spending $30 or more last year, up to 26% this year. Among social organizations, 34% spent more than $30 per background check last year, up from 21% the year before. And youth organizations experienced the most dramatic increase, from 12% spending $30 or more to 35%, with 15% above $60 per check. Why do you think organizations are spending so much more year over year? So a couple of items to note here. Last year, we had a much greater response from faith-based or religious organizations. We were able to draw specific insights out for that sector, and we found that they often screened in-house and spent a lot less than other types of nonprofit organizations on volunteer screening. The fact that religious and faith-based organizations made up a lower percentage of our respondents this year helps to magnify the trend a bit. But also part of this increase is likely that many organizations are becoming more educated about high-quality background checks and the typical costs associated with them. We hope that we've played a part in educating nonprofits. They know why a cheap check doesn't cut it. 5 years ago, our industry was selling a nationwide criminal database, a super search, US One search, etc., as the end-all be-all. In the past couple of years, organizations have realized that these databases are missing over 50% of the criminal information, and what is in there is outdated. So while these databases are a good overlay to find criminal activity, they're really horrible as a standalone search. Only by going directly to the county courthouse can you find real-time records. Organizations also are realizing that uncovering criminal history is not as easy as it looks on CSI. There's not one search that will yield results from every name and jurisdiction of a volunteer. To do a complete check, an organization must layer different searches, which will ultimately increase the cost. Over the past year, we've seen an increase in the number of products our clients run from 4 to 7, just different searches. In general, background screening costs have not gone up above inflation. While organizations are paying more, the bulk of the organizations are still paying under $20. In fact, our year-to-date average spend for background check is just under $12. Even if this is the prevailing trend, you have to assume that there are some organizations on the other end of the spectrum that might be getting priced out of the market. I think we said last year that screening was one of the rare hard cash costs of many volunteer management functions, whereas oftentimes managers can beg, borrow, and almost steal in-kind freeware and other resources for training, recognition, etc. Therefore, I would think these increases could be a strain on some larger volunteer-based organizations. What are some creative ways for groups that can't afford this to keep pace? Are you seeing these cost increases offset at all by volunteer paid checks? Verified Volunteers definitely is. When organizations on our platform turn on the contributions feature, or by asking the volunteer if they would consider contributing to the cost of the background checks, we see over 30% of the volunteers willing to do so. We've also seen organizations receive grants and donations specifically for screening programs. A few organizations I've noticed lately and worked with to set up are now requiring volunteers to pay for the check and offering a reimbursement once they've completed a certain number of hours. It is great that volunteers are willing to help out the organization they care about by contributing to the cost of their checks. As I mentioned in the last slide, they're also more likely to donate more at the end of the day. Training programs are also on the rise. First, training. We're seeing that the percentage of organizations that use formal training programs is now at 83%, up from last year's 74%. Overall, the vast majority of volunteer organizations train volunteers in formal programs. Among religious organizations, the sector with the lowest percentage of formal training programs, that percentage is still 75%. Does this surprise you guys at all? I'd be curious to know, first of all, what these organizations' definition of a training program would be, how formal and in-depth they're going. But I definitely think more organizations are trending up towards being safe rather than sorry. We're seeing a lot of organizations implement more formalized programs. These training programs have evolved from simply training a volunteer about roles and responsibilities within an organization to a formalized risk management and safety training program for vulnerable populations. In fact, one of our most frequent requests from our clients is to help them find qualified training and certification programs for their volunteers. Many of these requests start from their insurance companies. Based on this, we recently partnered with a company called Plan to Protect, which offers both web-based and personalized risk management, safety, and vulnerable population training and certification. It's great that organizations are really recognizing the need for formal training programs. VV partners with a few today. And MNA, I'm sure, has many resources for you on that piece as well. That brings us to challenges. Managing budgets is always a major concern and challenge, but despite the fact that organizations are spending more on individual volunteer background checks, volunteer screening is not their biggest budget item. That means their expenditure on checks relative to other expenses is not increasing. Instead, staffing, recruiting, and retaining qualified staff in an economy in which there's a war for talent has replaced background screening as the most costly item for most organizations. This story surprised me. More spend per check plus volunteers overall, plus more portion of their volunteers screened equals a net increase in the aggregate cost. Yet as a percentage of the overall budget, it's remaining steady or decreasing. That means volunteer management budgets are increasing overall pretty substantially, it seems. Where are these new resources coming from if there are not trade-offs taking place? Perhaps organizations are seeing a link between volunteer engagement and impact and donations that we mentioned, thus putting more money into those programs. I would also believe that issues finding and retaining staff have put more pressure on volunteer programs. We do know working for a nonprofit can be quite demanding, so that makes sense that it would be challenging to fill positions and keep them filled. Still, the staffing issue did not represent the main volunteer program challenge. Challenges in volunteer program management are changing. We asked responders to tell us what their biggest challenge is. We left the question open-ended so they could be specific about challenges their individual organizations were facing. Here's some of their direct responses to the question. Looks like recruiting volunteers and attracting volunteer talent is top amongst them. From a global non-screen volunteer marketplace trend perspective, these are interesting. The supply problem of work week volunteers is a perennial one. Recruiting in a saturated market and for long-term committed volunteers are probably related. These mean organizations are increasingly under pressure to provide quality and differentiated experiences, perhaps some incentives. I'd love to hear what the field thinks and would be of most value in terms of incentives. Is it more leadership opportunities, more empowerment for volunteers? That would be interesting to know. Now I'll get into a little bit more about verified volunteers specifically, and then leave some time for questions from you guys. Verified volunteers hears all the time. Screening volunteers can be painful. The volunteer screening process is not ideal. It's painful for the volunteer manager. It's frustrating for the volunteer. We're working on changing that. Low quality and incomplete searches, poor customer service issues, confusing and stressful compliance regulation to keep up with the FCRA, time-consuming processes, searching and administrative work, spreadsheets and paperwork, turnaround times, how long it's taking to get the records back, multiple screenings for the same volunteer. A volunteer gets screened for the YMCA and then wants to volunteer with your mentoring program. And at the end of the day, background screening can be costly. This is a little bit about the verified volunteers difference. Monthly updates and alerts to know that your volunteer hasn't committed a crime, and 3 months after starting to volunteer with your program. We do a monthly update for the first year of the national database. Flexible payment options and contributions. Outstanding volunteer experience, the quality of service, continuous innovation. We're always looking for new ways to help better our platform. And at the end of the day, the question we're always asked is, how much can we really save an organization? And obviously that always depends on your current level of screening, what you're currently doing. In regards to the background checks, there's always a higher level of check available, but we don't want to hurt your budget at the end of the day. We always want to be budget careful. One piece we make sure we go through during our direct conversations is a breakdown and comparison of your current search and what it really goes through, as many organizations don't really know what their background check truly covers. Verified Volunteers is not only screening, we're promoting a culture of volunteerism, the Fast Pass. This is the process of Verified Volunteers. The organization reaches out, asks the volunteer to be screened via email invitation, personalized link on your website, or through an integration with a volunteer management system. The volunteer clicks on that link, creates their account, and orders their background check. They get a copy, and so do you. Once the check is complete, volunteers can share their up-to-date background check with other organizations on the platform. The organizations, when a check is shared, both the volunteer and the original organization can earn credits on their invoice. The complete criminal locator. This is our highest level of screening. In terms of our regular packages, there always is a la carte items that you can add on, but this is our main level of screening. We start with a federal Office of Foreign Asset Control search. This is a high-level government watch list search. The next piece that we add is the National Sex Offender Registry, the National Sex Offender Public Website, or NSOPW, or Department of Justice Sex Offender Registry. It's the only real-time sex offender registry for all 50 states. The next piece you want to look into is where the volunteers currently live and have lived over the past 7 years. Where you've worked and played. We run a validated national database or national criminal search. And then the next piece that we layer on top of that is a Locator Select search, which I'll go into more detail in a few slides later. And what it does is integrates us with about 70% of the nation's sheriff's offices across the country. And we're pulling real-time arrest records to locate court records. The next piece that we add in is alias and maiden name searches. Because if someone changes their name, Jane Doe becomes Jane Smith, she now has 2 separate records. A monthly update of the national database, keeping your organization safe after volunteers are originally screened. Criminal background checks run comprehensively as outlined above reveal an average of 7 to 8% hit rates for at least one misdemeanor or felony. That compares to between 1 to 4% when only running some of the items above. This is a walkthrough of an actual background check, and just to get the whole picture of the whole volunteer picture. The first step there, the volunteer had lived in 4 counties within 3 states, California, Washington, and Arizona, which all came back clear, the county and state level. Second step, we searched our nationwide database, OFAC watch list, and NSOPW sex offender registry. All came back clear. Then using our proprietary technology, Locator Select, we located an arrest record in DuPage County, Illinois, confirmed at the county courthouse as felony burglary. Only Locator Select could find the record in DuPage County because DuPage County does not submit data to any national database. Another example, we located a child abuse conviction in Arizona at the county level under a maiden name. Only searching the maiden name at the local level could reveal the child abuse conviction because the crime was not recorded under the volunteer's primary name. Only with Verified Volunteers validated Locator Select. Supplement your package with Locator Select to get the most comprehensive picture of your volunteer. The typical national database search has lots of holes, but Locator Select fills many of those gaps. On average, Locator Select reveals 23% more criminal history than searches without it. That's why so many programs that go through Verified Volunteers and businesses that go through Sterling Talent Solutions use that service. Then we check the county or state to see if the arrest led to criminal history. We don't want to give you arrest records because that can again get you in issues with the FCRA if it didn't lead to a conviction. We access 2/3 of America's sheriff's offices to pull arrest records that match the volunteer. Only with validated Locator Select, we took a sample size of 400,000 individuals that were randomly selected to represent our overall national demographics. What we found, 18% had unique possible records to validate, 245,000 possible criminal records to validate in total, on average representing 3.5 records per candidate. 5% of candidates had been incarcerated within the last 12 months. 1.5% of candidates had been incarcerated within the last 90 days. 1% of candidates had unique reportable actionable criminal conviction records, such as theft, forgery, manufacture of controlled substance, statutory rape, and child abuse and endangerment. Locator Select makes our complete criminal locator the most thorough criminal background check in the industry. This is a little bit about the NSOPW, or the 50 State Department of Justice Sex Offender Registry search, nicknamed Drew Shadeen. The only real-time sex offender database straight from the Federal Department of Justice. It's recommended by all of the largest organizations across the country. Anything else, there's a sex offender registry inside of the national databases that many companies use. However, there's no requirement for county courthouses, state repositories to submit and update that information into that database. This is the only database that is required for every state to update to on a daily basis. Getting it right, background checks are confusing, and there are a ton of misconceptions, best practices to get it right. So we've gone over already a little bit of this. Getting a national sex offender check from the U.S. Department of Justice. Running current and prior residence address history searches at the county or state level. Running multiple nationwide locator searches to find records where volunteers have worked or played. Repeating the process of alias and maiden name searches. This is a little bit about our platform. The top here is, as you can see, it's two-sided. Organizations have their own side of our platform, and then volunteers have theirs. I'll kind of breeze right through this so we can get to questions here in a few minutes. This is the process that the volunteer sees. The first step is on the left there. They type in their name, date of birth, social security number, gender, contact information, and then potentially other names used. That information is automatically pulled through a social security number trace, but we use that to, maybe they went by another name that they've never signed up for anything for. We'll add that into the search. The second step is their current address. Once again, if you're running the highest level of screening, they'll have the ability to plug in their past 7 years of address history. However, again, they don't have to because it's being pulled through the social security number trace. The third step is all of the built-in consent and disclosure forms to background screening. The last checkbox that they'll check off is for e-signature compliance. This is the last step of our 4-step process. A quick checklist. The box there, which I know is hard to read, and I do apologize for that. Tried to make it as large as possible. But that's the optional contribution piece. Or some organizations choose to require volunteers to pay for the background check. This is the organization's dashboard. This is what you guys see. Screening and volunteer management made simple. It's not quite as robust as a full volunteer management system that you pay a lot of money for, but it definitely helps you keep your information on file and in order rather than using Excel spreadsheets. This is where you organize, filter, and review background checks. You can mark all clears this eligible at once to make it a little bit easier for you. But when the result is considered, those are the background checks that you want to look into. You just click on their name and opens up their background check, just like that. You can read into each search that was run. The green check marks mean that nothing came up in that search. The yellow exclamation point is where the hit came up. So you'll scroll down. I can't scroll on this screenshot, but on the actual report, you would just scroll down, find that search, and be able to read into the report and what happened. Volunteers love the platform too. From the volunteer profile, they can track progress, view other organizations in their area, share their check. All of this is optional. They do not have to do anything with their profile. That's completely up to them. Verified Volunteers is hosted in the cloud. You'll enjoy access free of charge to volunteer tracking tools, filters, reminders, all significantly reduced administrative time. Use our technology to organize and edit your volunteer pool. Easily upload and export lists of volunteers. View volunteer profiles and more. So a little bit about account setup. It takes us about anywhere from 1 to 3 business days to get organizations up and running on the Verified Volunteers platform. But then on day 1, you're good to go. Most organizations that I support watch the Vimeo videos that they receive in their welcome email, and then just give me a call when they have an issue or a quick question, because it's very easy to use. We also do host 3 online trainings per week at 1 o'clock Eastern Time. Here's some quick testimonials that organizations have shared about us. I will send out this to everyone that joined the call today as well. There's no annual fees, free volunteer software. Organizations only pay for background checks, if at all. Discounted pricing through the Michigan Nonprofit Association, as long as you mention it, as long as you work with me directly, because we want to make sure that we're keeping track of everything on our end. Volume-based pricing, the more you screen, the lower the cost. Setting up an organization account requires a little paperwork, and we provide training from our client care team. For more information, please don't hesitate to reach out to myself, Brian Noller. My number's there, 216-402-7501, or by email at bryan@verifiedvolunteers.com. At this point, I wanted to open it up for questions. I know I spoke a lot here, but want to see if there's any questions that came up during the presentation today.
Not seeing any quite yet, Brian. Sorry, there's a little feedback, but please use this time to ask any questions that you might have about trends or the Verified Volunteers.
Either. Happy to go over any questions today, or feel free to contact me directly, or let Sarah know that you'd like to speak with me and we can set up a time to talk.
And thank you to everyone for joining. We'll be sending out the recording and PowerPoint slides. We'll have a couple more minutes too if you think of any other questions.